There had been no female members until Gwen had inherited Master Thomas's membership, and she had a quiet suspicion that it had only been Lord Mycroft's intervention that had allowed her to keep the membership. The average member of the club came to the Diogenes to get away from the wife and children, according to Master Thomas. They didn't even permit female servants within the club's walls. Even so, Gwen didn't visit very often. The club's atmosphere only appealed to a certain type of man. She jumped out of the carriage and walked up to the doorman, who recognized her at once. The Diogenes had no membership cards. The only way in was through the main door, forcing everyone to pass under the doorman's gaze. He knew everyone who was allowed into the club and would have denied entry to anyone else unless they were accompanied by a club member. The doorman nodded to her and stepped aside. Gwen nodded back and stepped into the club. Absolute silence fell as soon as the door swung closed behind her. Talking was forbidden within the club, except in a handful of isolated and heavily soundproofed rooms. Members who spoke out loud or even ate too loudly could be fined or, as a last resort, evicted from the club permanently. Very few former members were ever allowed to reapply. The receptionist looked up at her as she approached, one eyebrow lifted questioningly. Gwen picked up the book of members and tapped Lord Mycroft's name. The receptionist turned and pointed to a diagram on the wall, indicating that Lord Mycroft was in one of the private dining rooms. Gwen smiled at him, nodded in acknowledgement, and headed for the stairs. At least she wouldn't have to face him in one of the larger rooms, where the slightest sound could bring the guards. She glanced into the first floor as she walked up the stairs. A handful of chairs were scattered around, with men sitting in them reading the newspapers or a handful of heavy books. Most of them were smoking heavily, the stench making Gwen's nose twitch unpleasantly. Healers had proved that smoking tobacco was bad for human lungs, but they hadn't managed to discourage very many smokers from continuing to smoke. Gwen hadn't even tried to ban magicians from smoking. The third floor was divided into a handful of rooms, ensuring absolute privacy for the diners and their guests. Gwen smiled as a steward intercepted her before she could reach Lord Mycroft's room. She held up her card, which he read quickly, blinking in surprise. Between her suit and the darkened corridor, her femininity had simply passed unnoticed. He must be new, Gwen decided, as he took the card down the corridor. If Lord Mycroft refused to see her, the stewards would evict her with as much force as necessary. The club took very good care of its members. He returned a moment later and beckoned her forward, past a long series of closed doors to one door that had been left on the latch. Gwen opened it and stepped inside, spotting Lord Mycroft on the other side of a large table. He was splitting his attention between a dinner of roast beef and a small pile of paperwork from the office. "Lady Gwen," he said, as the door clicked closed behind her. The door was locked. Only the right key could open it from the outside. "Would you care for something to eat or drink? They do a very good roast beef here with excellent potatoes." Gwen sat down facing him and picked up the menu. Recently there had been a fashion for Turkish food sweeping London, a reaction to Turkey's recent defeat of a French-backed revolution in Greece, but the Diogenes paid no lip service to such brief fads. The menu was typically English, with only a handful of dishes that came from outside the British Isles. For most of the club's members, she knew, the haggis would be exotic enough. "A beef sandwich, I think," she said, marking it on a sheet of paper and dropping it down the tube to the kitchen. They'd send the meal up through the dumbwaiter, minimising contact between the staff and the club members. "What was Sir Travis doing for you?" Lord Mycroft didn't object to her interrupting his dinner. "Diplomacy," he said simply. "As a sensitive, he was very capable of seeing what the other side actually wanted in negotiations." Gwen nodded. Diplomats always started out with exaggerated demands and then allowed their counterparts to whittle them down until they arrived at a compromise both sides could live with.